Miss Marple and the Death of Dolly Bantry. Welcome, dear listeners. I'm Ailey, your host from Cafe Tales, and I'm so glad you could join us tonight. It's always such a joy to see how these cozy mysteries connect people from all over the world. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from, and are you enjoying our Miss Marple stories so far? Don't forget to subscribe, as more than 80% of our listeners haven't yet, and we share new mysteries every day. Now get comfortable, settle, in with your blanket and tea, and let's uncover tonight's mystery together. The morning mist hung low over Gossington Hall, creeping across the well-tended lawns like a gray silk scarf, carelessly dropped by some passing spirit. Inside the breakfast room, Mrs. Dolly Bantry sat at her customary place at the mahogany table, her silver hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour. Her keen blue eyes scanned the Morning Post with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had managed a large household for the better part of 30 years. "Cook says the orange marmalade is particularly fine this morning, madam," announced James, the butler, as he set down a fresh rack of toast. His voice carried that measured tone perfected by generations of well-trained servants, neither obsequious nor familiar, but pleasantly respectful. "Splendid," replied Mrs. Bantry, not looking up from a letter bearing the letterhead of the saint. "Marry Me Hospital Fund. Though I do hope she hasn't been too liberal with the sugar again. The committee was quite specific about economy measures at our last meeting." James cleared his throat delicately. "There is one rather unusual item in this morning's post, madam. A card that appears to be—" He paused, his usual composure flickering slightly. "That is to say, it seems to be a condolence card." Mrs. Bantry's head snapped up, her eyebrows arching in surprise. "A condolence card? Whatever do you mean, James? Who on earth would be sending condolences to Gossington Hall?" The butler approached with obvious reluctance, carrying a black-edged envelope on a silver salver. "I'm afraid the card is addressed to you personally, madam. Most peculiar, if I may say so." Mrs. Bantry took the envelope, examining the typewritten address with growing bewilderment. "Mrs. Dolly Bantry, Gossington Hall." She opened it carefully, revealing a card bordered in deep black. Its message printed in somber script, "In deepest sympathy for your loss." Below, in a different hand, someone had added, "So sudden, so cruel." A laugh escaped her lips, bright and incredulous. How perfectly ridiculous. Someone has made the most dreadful mistake. She turned the card over in her hands. "Though I must say, it's rather well done. Expensive paper, proper printing. Someone went to considerable trouble for such an error. Perhaps a mix-up at the post office." "Madam, perhaps." Mrs. Bantry slipped the card into the pocket of her morning dress. "We shall have to telephone them later and sort it out. Now, do pour the tea, James. Colonel Bantry will be down presently, and you know how he detests waiting for his morning cup." As if summoned by her words, Colonel Arthur Bantry appeared in the doorway, his military bearing still evident despite his 60-odd years. His mustache was freshly waxed, his tweeds immaculate, and his eyes held that particular alertness that came from decades of rising before dawn. "Morning, my dear," he said, pecking his wife's cheek before settling into his chair. "Sleep well?" "Tolerably. Thank you, though we've had rather an amusing start to the day." She showed him the condolence card. "Someone appears to think I'm dead." Colonel Bantry examined the card with the methodical attention he had once applied to military dispatches. Postmarked yesterday evening. Local postmark, too. St. Marry Me." He handed it back. "Curious business." "Oh, Arthur, surely you don't think there's anything sinister in it. It's simply some muddle-headed person getting their addresses confused." "No doubt you're right, my dear, though I must say, the fellow who wrote that additional message has rather dramatic tendencies. So sudden, so cruel, indeed." Their conversation was interrupted by voices in the hall. James appeared again, this time accompanying a small procession of morning callers. "Mrs. Pike to see you, madam, and Miss Denham. They said it was regarding the hospital fund." Mrs. Harriet Pike entered first, a thin, precise woman in her 50s, whose gray hair was pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch her features. She carried a leather portfolio with the careful attention of someone handling precious documents. Behind her came Veronica Denham, Mrs. Bantry's cousin, whose London elegance seemed slightly out of place in the morning light of a country breakfast room. "Dolly, darling," Veronica exclaimed, rushing forward to embrace her cousin. "How divine to see you looking so well. I was just telling Harriet what a marvel you are, managing all these committees and charitable works." Mrs. Pike inclined her head stiffly. "Good morning, Mrs. Bantry. I do hope we're not intruding, but there are several matters regarding the fund accounts that require your immediate attention." "Not at all, Harriet. Please, both of you sit down. James, more cups if you would." As the women settled themselves, Colonel Bantry excused himself. "I'll leave you ladies to your committee work. I promised Haydock I'd look in on that mare of his." "Give the doctor my regards," Mrs. Bantry called after him, then turned her attention to her visitors. "Now then, what's so urgent about the accounts that it couldn't wait until our regular meeting?" Mrs. Pike opened her portfolio with ritualistic precision. "There are several discrepancies I've discovered. Nothing serious, of course, but they require clarification. Perhaps we might review them privately." "Nonsense, Harriet. Veronica is family, and besides, she's offered to help with the fund's administration. Transparency is essential in charitable work," Veronica smiled warmly. "I do so want to contribute something meaningful while I'm staying in the country. London society can be so frivolous." As Mrs. Pike began spreading papers across the table, the morning took on a peaceful rhythm. The autumn sunlight streamed through the windows, warming the breakfast room and casting dancing patterns on the polished silver. Mrs. Bantry listened to Harriet's methodical recitation of figures and expenditures, occasionally nodding or asking a clarifying question. It was during this domestic tableau that the doorbell rang again. James returned with two more visitors, Mr. Dennis Fairbrass, the antique dealer from Much Benham, and to Mrs. Bantry's particular delight, Miss Jane Marple from St. Mary Me. "My dear Miss Marple," Mrs. Bantry rose to greet the elderly lady. "What perfect timing. I was just thinking yesterday that I hadn't seen you in far too long." Miss Marple, a small white-haired woman with bright, observant eyes, smiled gently. "I was passing by and thought I might leave this small gift." She held up a beautifully knitted comforter in soft blue wool. "I remembered you mentioning how drafty the morning room becomes as the weather turns." "How thoughtful of you. James, do show Mr. Fairbrass to the drawing room. I'll be with him shortly." Mr. Fairbrass, a portly man with calculating eyes, bowed slightly. "No hurry, Mrs. Bantry. I merely wish to discuss the possibility of evaluating some of your lovely pieces for insurance purposes." "Naturally." After he was escorted away, Miss Marple settled into a chair, declining tea but accepting the warmth of the company. Her eyes, seemingly casual in their survey of the room, took in every detail. The scattered fund papers, Mrs. Pike's nervous efficiency, Veronica's fashionable restlessness, and most particularly, the black-edged condolence card lying beside Mrs. Bantry's plate. "I do hope I'm not interrupting important business," Miss Marple said mildly. "Not at all, though we have had the most peculiar start to the morning." Mrs. Bantry retrieved the card. "Someone has sent me a condolence card. Rather premature, wouldn't you say?" Miss Marple examined the card with the same gentle attention she might give to a piece of knitting. Her fingers, still nimble despite her years, turned it over carefully. How very odd. The address is typewritten, I see. Yes, and posted locally yesterday evening. We can't imagine who might have made such a mistake. Mistakes, Miss Marple murmured thoughtfully, are often more revealing than truths. She held the envelope up to the light streaming through the window. The paper is quite good quality, expensive, and the postmark is very clear. 7 yesterday evening from the St. Mary Me post office. Mrs. Pike looked up from her papers with mild irritation. Surely it's simply some confusion at the printers. These things happen. Oh yes, agreed Miss Marple pleasantly, though one does wonder why someone would go to the trouble of adding that personal message. So sudden, so cruel. It suggests rather intimate knowledge, doesn't it? The conversation was interrupted by the return of James with the second post. Several more cards for you, madam, and Dr. Haydock wishes to know if this afternoon would be convenient for his visit. More cards? Sympathy cards, madam. Quite a few of them, actually. A sudden chill seemed to settle over the sunny breakfast room, as if the morning mist had found its way indoors after all. Miss Marple sat down her teacup with infinite care and smiled her most innocent smile. How very interesting, she said quietly. How very interesting indeed. The morning had settled into that particular rhythm of English country hospitality, when disaster struck with the swift, brutal efficiency of a hawk descending upon unsuspecting prey. Miss Marple remained in the breakfast room, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on what appeared to be a small infant's booty. Her presence had that curiously comforting quality possessed by certain elderly ladies, neither intrusive nor entirely unobtrusive, but somehow essential to the proper order of things. I do hope you'll stay for 11, Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry said, returning from her brief conference with Mr. Fairbrass about the insurance valuation. Cook has made those little seed cakes you're so fond of. How very kind of you, my dear. I should be delighted. At precisely 11 James appeared with the tea trolley, its silver appointments gleaming despite the October morning's gray light. The ritual of 11s at Gossington Hall was as fixed as the sunrise. Delicate china, paper-thin cucumber sandwiches, Cook's famous seed cakes, and Mrs. Bantry's particular preference for orange marmalade on thin toast. Colonel Bantry had returned from his visit to Dr. Haydock, bringing with him the cheerful energy that fresh air and good conversation invariably produced in military men. Mrs. Pike had been persuaded to stay, though she sat with the rigid posture of someone who considered social pleasures a distraction from more serious duties. Veronica descended the stairs, looking perfectly turned out in a traveling costume that must have cost more than most people earned in a month. "Arthur," Mrs. Bantry said as her husband settled into his favorite chair, "did Dr. Haydock have anything interesting to say about that mare?" Sound as a pound, according to him, though he did mention he'd be calling round this afternoon. "Something about checking on your constitution after that bout of indigestion last week." "Nonsense. I haven't felt better in months." Mrs. Bantry reached for the marmalade pot, a heavy crystal affair that had been her mother's. Really, the way medical men fuss over the slightest thing, she spread the marmalade with the careful attention of someone who had performed this simple act thousands of times. The orange preserve caught the light amber. The first bite was taken with the unconscious confidence of complete routine. Then everything changed. The transformation was so sudden, so complete, that for a moment the assembled company could only stare in bewildered silence. Mrs. Bantry's face, which had been animated with conversation, became first puzzled, then alarmed, then ashen. Her hand flew to her throat. "I say," she gasped, "I feel most peculiar." The next few seconds passed with the distorted clarity that accompanies genuine crisis. Mrs. Bantry's face turned a grayish-blue color, that was alarming to witness. Her breathing became labored, her pulse, when Colonel Bantry frantically sought it at her wrist, threadier than spider's silk. "Dolly!" Colonel Bantry caught her as she began to slide from her chair. "James, telephone Dr. Haydock at once." But Miss Marple, moving with surprising swiftness for a lady of her years, had already reached the telephone in the hall. Her voice, calm and precise, could be heard requesting the doctor's immediate attendance. "Most urgent," she said. "Mrs. Bantry has collapsed." In the breakfast room, controlled chaos reigned. Veronica had gone quite pale and was fanning herself with a napkin. Mrs. Pike stood frozen, her hands pressed to her mouth. Colonel Bantry had lifted his wife bodily and was carrying her toward the drawing-room sofa. Miss Marple returned, and with the quiet authority that certain people naturally possess in emergencies, began to organize the scene. "Colonel Bantry, lay her flat, please. Elevate her feet slightly. Mrs. Pike, would you be so good as to fetch a blanket from upstairs? Miss Denham, perhaps you could ask James to prepare some brandy." But Miss Marple's most significant action went unnoticed by the others. As she bent over Mrs. Bantry's abandoned place setting, she lifted the plate containing the half-eaten toast and inhaled deeply. Her expression, already grave, became thoughtful in a way that might have alarmed anyone paying attention. Quietly, she moved the marmalade pot to one side, placing it carefully on the sideboard where it would be out of immediate reach. Dr. Haydock arrived within minutes, his medical bag in hand, and his usually jovial manner replaced by professional concern. He was a man in his 50s, robust and reliable, with the kind of bedside manner that inspired confidence in even the most anxious patients. "Right," he said briskly, kneeling beside the sofa where Mrs. Bantry lay frighteningly still. "Let's see what we have here." His examination was thorough and swift, pulse, breathing, pupils, skin color, each detail noted with practiced efficiency. The assembled watchers hung on his every movement, seeking reassurance in his competence. "Well?" Colonel Bantry's voice was tight with worry. Dr. Haydock looked grave. "I'm afraid Mrs. Bantry is very ill indeed. We need to get her to hospital. Immediately? James, telephone for an ambulance, would you?" "Hospital." Veronica spoke for the first time since the collapse. "Is it really that serious?" "I'm afraid so. The symptoms suggest some form of acute poisoning, though I can't say what type without proper tests." The word poisoning fell into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled company. Mrs. Pike sank heavily into a chair. Colonel Bantry's face went white beneath his tan. "Poisoning," he repeated. "But how? What could possibly—" "That's for the experts to determine," Dr. Haydock said firmly. "Right now, our priority is getting Mrs. Bantry proper medical attention." The ambulance arrived with commendable speed. Its crew professional and reassuring. Mrs. Bantry was carefully transferred to a stretcher, still unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. Colonel Bantry climbed into the ambulance beside her, his face a mask of barely controlled anguish. As the vehicle disappeared down the drive, an oppressive silence settled over Gossington Hall. The remaining guests found themselves uncertain of the proper protocol. Did one simply leave? Stay to help? The social convention seemed inadequate for such circumstances. "I think," said Miss Marple gently, "that we should perhaps inform Inspector Slack if Dr. Haydock suspects poisoning." Veronica shuddered delicately. Surely it was just something she ate. Food poisoning, these things happen. "Indeed they do," agreed Miss Marple, "though one wonders what Mrs. Bantry consumed that the rest of us did not." It was Mrs. Pike who provided the answer, her voice barely above a whisper. "The marmalade. She was the only one who had the marmalade." All eyes turned to the sideboard where Miss Marple had placed the crystal pot. It sat there, innocent and gleaming, giving no hint of the tragedy it might have contained. Dr. Haydock returned alone just after 2 his face bearing news that everyone dreaded to hear but felt compelled to learn. He gathered the remaining company in the drawing room, his manner professionally gentle but unmistakably final. "I'm very sorry," he began, and those 4 words told them everything. "Mrs. Bantry passed away at the hospital an hour ago. Despite our best efforts, the poisoning was too advanced. There will, of course, need to be an inquest." The silence that followed was profound. Colonel Bantry, who had returned with the doctor, sat like a man carved from stone. Veronica began to cry quietly into a handkerchief. Mrs. Pike stared fixedly at her hands. Only Miss Marple seemed strangely composed, though her blue eyes held a sharpness that hadn't been there at breakfast. By evening, the news had spread through St. Mary Me with the speed that only truly shocking events achieve. "Mrs. Dolly Bantry is dead. Poison at breakfast." The phrase was repeated in cottage after cottage, shop after shop, pub after pub. Inspector Slack arrived as darkness fell, accompanied by a constable and the particular air of grim efficiency that police investigations invariably bring to peaceful country houses. The hall was sealed, statements taken, and arrangements made for what would undoubtedly be a complex and thorough inquiry. "No public inquest yet," Slack announced to the assembled household. "Private arrangements for now, until we understand exactly what we're dealing with." Colonel Bantry had withdrawn to his study, accepting condolences with the stunned politeness of the newly bereaved. The guests had finally departed, leaving behind them an atmosphere of shock and speculation that would linger long after their footsteps faded on the gravel drive. As Miss Marple walked slowly back to her cottage through the October evening, she carried with her not only the profound sadness of sudden loss, but also a collection of small, troubling details that refused to arrange themselves into any comfortable pattern. The sympathy cards arriving before the tragedy, the marmalade that had tasted bitter to no one but Mrs. Bantry, the precise timing of Dr. Haydock's intended visit. Most puzzling of all was her own curious sense that the day's events, terrible as they were, had unfolded with an almost theatrical precision that seemed somehow arranged. She paused at her garden gate and looked back at Gossington Hall, its windows, now blazing with light as the police continued their work. Somewhere in that maze of rooms and corridors lay the truth. She was certain of it, but what that truth might be, and why someone should want the world to believe that Dolly Bantry was dead, remained as mysterious as the October mist that was, once again settling over the village of St. Mary Me. The morning after tragedy strikes a household often possesses a peculiar quality of unreality, as if the very air has become thinner, and ordinary objects have taken on an almost dreamlike significance. Miss Marple discovered this to be particularly true as she approached Gossington Hall through the gray dawn light. Her knitting bag tucked securely under her arm, and her mind occupied with thoughts that would have surprised those who knew her only as a harmless elderly lady with a fondness for village gossip. She had slept poorly, which was unusual for someone, blessed with a clear conscience of a life well lived. But certain details from yesterday's tragedy had worried at her mind, like loose threads in a piece of knitting, refusing to be ignored or smoothed away. The sympathy cards arriving before any cause for sympathy, the marmalade jar so carefully moved aside, the curious composure with which Dr. Haydock had announced Mrs. Bantry's death, as if he were reading from a prepared script rather than delivering spontaneous news. Inspector Slack had posted a constable at the main entrance, but Miss Marple knew Gossington Hall as well as she knew her own cottage. The kitchen garden entrance had never been locked in all the years she'd known the Bantrys, and this morning proved no exception to that trusting country custom. James discovered her in the breakfast room, standing quietly beside the table where yesterday's tragedy had unfolded. To his credit, the butler showed no surprise at finding the elderly lady in his domain uninvited. Perhaps, Miss Marple reflected, long service in a country house taught one to accept the inexplicable appearances of determined ladies as simply another aspect of domestic life. "Good morning, James," she said pleasantly. "I do hope you slept better than I managed to." "Not particularly well, Miss Marple, if I may say so. The house feels different somehow." "Indeed, it does. I was wondering if I might have a moment to examine Mrs. Bantry's place-setting from yesterday, for my own peace of mind, you understand?" James glanced toward the door, then nodded slowly. "I haven't cleared everything away yet. Inspector Slack said to leave things as they were until the London men arrive. Very sensible of him. The breakfast table remained much as it had been left, though someone had covered the plates with clean tea towels. Miss Marple lifted these with the careful reverence of an archaeologist uncovering ancient artifacts. Mrs. Bantry's plate still held the partially eaten toast, its surface now hardened, but still clearly showing the golden spread of marmalade. Miss Marple bent close and inhaled deeply. The scent was predominantly orange, as one would expect, with the familiar tartness of a well-made preserve, but underneath so faint as to be almost imaginary, lay something else, something green and bitter that had no place in breakfast marmalade. "James," she said thoughtfully, "I don't suppose you recall which jar of marmalade was used yesterday?" "The crystal one, Miss Marple. Mrs. Bantry's particular favorite, her mother's recipe made fresh just last week." Miss Marple examined the jar more carefully. The preserve looked perfectly normal, its color a rich amber gold, its consistency thick but not stiff. She took a clean teaspoon from the sideboard and extracted a small portion from the main body of the marmalade. This she tasted with the deliberate attention of a wine connoisseur. "Excellent," she murmured. "Cook has quite outdone herself." Then, with infinite care, she scraped a tiny amount from the rim of the jar, where a small residue of marmalade had dried into a darker, more concentrated mass. This second taste made her expression change entirely. The bitterness was unmistakable now, sharp and green, and utterly foreign to any orange preserve. Miss Marple set down the spoon and moved to the French doors that led to the garden. The herb border ran along the morning room's eastern wall, planted with the usual collection of culinary and medicinal plants that any well-managed country house maintained. The foxglove plants stood at the border's far end, their tall spires now bare of summer's purple bells, but still recognizably dangerous to anyone with knowledge of country lore. Miss Marple knelt carefully beside them, her sharp eyes scanning the ground for any evidence of recent disturbance. She found it in the form of several crushed leaves, still green, but beginning to brown at the edges. Someone had been here recently, gathering the plant material with less care than skill. The leaves had been broken rather than cut, and fragments lay scattered on the earth like evidence of hasty work. "Most interesting," she said to herself, collecting several of the fragments in her handkerchief. Returning to the breakfast room, Miss Marple turned her attention to Mrs. Bantry's usual morning routine. The desk in the corner held the household correspondence, charity committee papers, and personal letters that formed the daily business of a conscientious country lady. The desk itself was a Georgian piece, elegant and practical, with numerous small drawers and compartments for organizing important documents. Miss Marple noticed immediately that one of the desk's brass handles bore the faintest smudge of something that might have been marmalade. More tellingly, the small key that usually lay openly on the desk's leather surface was missing. A thorough but careful search revealed the key beneath the desk's blotting pad, positioned as if it had been hastily replaced by someone unfamiliar with Mrs. Bantry's habits. The area around the key showed a faint outline in the dust, suggesting it had been moved and then repositioned imperfectly. "Someone has been through Mrs. Bantry's private papers," Miss Marple observed to James, who had remained discreetly nearby. "Surely not, Miss Marple. The house was never left unattended yesterday." "No, indeed it wasn't, which makes the matter rather more interesting than it might otherwise be." Miss Marple opened the desk carefully, noting that while most compartments appeared undisturbed, one small drawer showed signs of having been rifled through with some urgency. The papers it contained, mostly correspondence related to the hospital fund, had been replaced but not in their original order. A fragment of orange peel caught her attention, wedged into the corner of the drawer, where it had apparently been overlooked by whoever had conducted the search. But when Miss Marple examined it closely, she discovered it was not orange peel at all, but rather a piece of foxglove leaf, its distinctive shape unmistakable to anyone familiar with the plant. "James," she said slowly, "was anyone alone in this room for any significant period yesterday?" The butler considered carefully. "Well, Mrs. Pike spent some time here going over her papers before the others arrived, and Miss Denham came down early. Said she wanted to write some letters, but surely you don't think either of them would—" He trailed off, unable to voice such a suggestion about guests in his master's house. "What I think," Miss Marple said gently, "is that someone went to considerable trouble to ensure that Mrs. Bantry consumed a particular spoonful of marmalade yesterday morning. Someone who had access to both the herb garden and this room, and who possessed enough knowledge of plants to know that foxglove leaves, when properly prepared, can mimic certain forms of natural heart failure." She paused, looking out at the garden where the October sun was beginning to burn away the morning mist. "What troubles me most, James, is the question of timing. How did our mysterious correspondent know to send sympathy cards before there was any cause for sympathy? Unless, of course, they knew exactly when that cause would arise." James looked deeply uncomfortable. "Miss Marple, surely you're not suggesting that Mrs. Bantry's death was planned?" "I'm suggesting, my dear James, that someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that the world believes Mrs. Bantry is dead. Whether she actually is dead, however, is another matter entirely." With that cryptic observation, Miss Marple gathered up her knitting bag and the small collection of evidence she had assembled: the foxglove fragments, the displaced key, the bitter residue on the marmalade jar's rim. Each piece of the puzzle was small in itself, but together they painted a picture of careful premeditation that was far more chilling than any crime of passion could have been. As she made her way back through the kitchen garden, Miss Marple reflected that whoever had orchestrated yesterday's events possessed both intelligence and patience. They had planned carefully, executed precisely, and nearly succeeded in creating the perfect crime. Nearly, but not quite. For in their very perfection lay the flaw that would ultimately prove their undoing. Truth, Miss Marple had learned through long experience, was rarely as neat and tidy as fiction, and yesterday's tragedy had been altogether too neat and tidy for her liking. The question now was not whether Mrs. Bantry had been murdered, but why someone wanted the world to think she had died, and what they hoped to accomplish while everyone believed her to be safely buried. Those answers, Miss Marple was certain, would prove far more interesting than the mystery of the poisoned marmalade itself. The morning brought with it a procession of delivery vans winding their way up the drive to Gossington Hall, each bearing the somber cargo of condolence that follows death in a well-established community. Florists' vans, telegraph boys with messages of sympathy, and the discreet representatives of various charitable organizations arrived in steady succession, transforming the usually quiet country house into a center of melancholy activity. Miss Marple observed this parade from her cottage garden, where she was ostensibly tending to her late roses, but in reality maintaining the sort of watchful interest that had served her so well in previous mysteries. From her vantage point behind the hedge, she could see each arrival clearly, while remaining herself unobserved, a position she had found invaluable over the years. The wreaths began arriving shortly after 10. The first was a magnificent arrangement of white lilies and chrysanthemums from the vicar and Mrs. Clement, followed by a more modest but equally heartfelt offering from the Women's Institute. Each floral tribute was accompanied by a card expressing the sender's shock and sympathy at Mrs. Bantry's sudden passing. It was the third wreath that caught Miss Marple's particular attention. A large arrangement of autumn flowers, bronze chrysanthemums, orange marigolds, and deep red chrysanthemums, arrived with a card bearing the inscription, "Hospital Fund, in deepest sorrow." The delivery man handled it with appropriate reverence, and James received it at the door with the grave dignity befitting such an occasion. 20 minutes later, a second wreath arrived. This one was simpler, white carnations and ferns, but bore an identical card with the same inscription, "Hospital Fund, in deepest sorrow." Miss Marple set down her pruning shears with considerable interest. 2 wreaths from the same organization was unusual, though not unprecedented. What struck her as curious was the timing of their arrival, and the slight difference in the card's appearance, visible even from her distant observation post. Shortly before noon, she made her way to Gossington Hall, carrying a basket of late apples from her orchard as a suitable excuse for calling upon the bereaved household. She found the hall transformed into a house of mourning, with black crepe draped over the mirrors and the blinds drawn in the traditional manner. James admitted her with the subdued efficiency of a man accustomed to managing domestic crisis. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call. Colonel Bantry is in his study receiving callers. Shall I announce you?" "Perhaps in a moment, James. I was actually hoping to pay my respects at the floral tributes first. I understand there have been some lovely arrangements." The wreaths had been arranged in the conservatory, where their beauty could be properly appreciated while not overwhelming the main rooms of the house. Miss Marple moved among them with appropriate solemnity, reading each card and admiring the craftsmanship of the various florists. When she reached the 2 hospital fund wreaths, she paused to examine them more closely. The cards, while bearing identical inscriptions, were clearly written by different hands. The first showed an elegant, flowing script with particularly long downward strokes on the letters F and G. The second displayed a heavier hand, with one peculiarity that made Miss Marple's pulse quicken. The letter E in several words was slightly misaligned, sitting a fraction higher than the other letters in a way that suggested a typing machine with a faulty key. "Quite beautiful, aren't they?" Miss Marple turned to find Mrs. Pike approaching, her face appropriately grave but her eyes bright with what might have been anticipation. She was dressed in deep mourning, though Miss Marple couldn't help noticing that the black costume was remarkably well fitted for something presumably acquired in haste. Indeed they are. So thoughtful of the fund to send 2 arrangements. Mrs. Pike's expression flickered slightly. 2? "Oh, yes. Well, there was some confusion about the ordering. I felt it was important that the committee's sympathy be properly expressed. And when I discovered that someone else had already arranged for flowers," she gestured vaguely toward the larger wreath, "I thought it best to send our own tribute as well." "How very considerate. I imagine there will be considerable reorganization required, now that Mrs. Bantry is no longer with us." "Yes, indeed." Mrs. Pike's voice took on a note of determined efficiency. In fact, I've already spoken with the vicar about taking over the fund's administration temporarily, just until proper arrangements can be made. Of course, there are accounts to be settled, donors to notify, that sort of thing. Naturally, I'm sure Mrs. Bantry would be grateful to know the fund's work will continue seamlessly. That's exactly what I told Colonel Bantry. Poor man. He's quite overwhelmed by all the arrangements. I've offered to handle the administrative details so he needn't be troubled with such matters during his bereavement. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, while noting the eager gleam in Mrs. Pike's eyes. How very thoughtful. I suppose the fund's records are all in good order. Oh yes, naturally, though there are always a few loose ends to tie up. Nothing significant, but these things must be done properly. Mrs. Pike paused, then added with studied casualness, I don't suppose you know if Mrs. Bantry kept the fund's files here at the Hall. I'd hate for anything important to be overlooked. I'm afraid I couldn't say, though I imagine Colonel Bantry would be happy to discuss such matters with you directly. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another caller, Mr. Dennis Fairbrass, the antique dealer, carrying a small but expensive-looking floral arrangement and wearing an expression of professional sympathy. Ladies, he said, bowing slightly. Such a tragic loss. Mrs. Bantry was a true connoisseur of beautiful things. Indeed she was, agreed Miss Marple. I understand you were planning to value some pieces for her. Mr. Fairbrass's eyes brightened, slightly despite the somber circumstances. Yes, for insurance purposes. These old houses contain such treasures, often unrecognized by their owners. I do hope Colonel Bantry will still consider proceeding with the evaluation, in Mrs. Bantry's memory, as it were. Mrs. Pike looked sharply at the antique dealer. Surely such matters can wait until after the funeral. Of course, though sometimes these things are easier to handle sooner rather than later. Grief can make decision-making so difficult, Mr. Fairbrass arranged his features into an expression of practiced concern. I merely wish to be helpful during this difficult time. Miss Marple observed this exchange with growing interest. The speed with which both Mrs. Pike and Mr. Fairbrass were positioning themselves to help with Mrs. Bantry's affairs was remarkable, even by the standards of a village where helpful neighbors were the norm rather than the exception. I wonder, she said mildly, has anyone contacted Mrs. Bantry's cousin, Miss Denham? I believe she was staying here when the tragedy occurred. Veronica left this morning, Mrs. Pike said quickly. Quite upset. Naturally. She said she couldn't bear to remain in the house where it happened. How understandable, though I'm surprised she didn't offer to help with arrangements. Family, usually. She was quite overcome, Mr. Fairbrass interjected, barely able to speak when she said goodbye. Some people simply cannot cope with such situations. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, though she recalled Veronica Denham as a woman of considerable composure and practical intelligence. The idea that she would flee in hysterical grief seemed somewhat out of character. Well, she said finally, I suppose I should pay my respects to Colonel Bantry. James mentioned that Inspector Slack wished to speak with me as well. Inspector Slack? Mrs. Pike's voice sharpened. Whatever could he want with you? Routine inquiries, I imagine. The police are always so thorough in these matters. As Miss Marple made her way toward Colonel Bantry's study, she reflected on the morning's observations. 2 wreaths from the same organization, one bearing the distinctive misaligned E that she had seen before on hospital fund circulars. Mrs. Pike's unseemly eagerness to assume control of the fund's administration. Mr. Fairbrass's persistent interest in evaluating the hall's contents, and Veronica Denham's sudden departure from a house where, less than 24 hours earlier, she'd been comfortably settled as a welcomed guest. Each detail in itself might be explained by the natural disruption that follows sudden death. Taken together, however, they suggested something rather different. A carefully orchestrated rush to secure advantage, while grief and shock provided convenient cover for actions that might otherwise attract unwelcome scrutiny. Miss Marple paused. Outside Colonel Bantry's study, her hand on the doorknob, and wondered what Inspector Slack had discovered in his preliminary investigations. If her growing suspicions were correct, the inspector might find himself dealing with something far more complex than a simple case of accidental poisoning. The question was whether anyone else had noticed the unseemly haste with which certain people were positioning themselves to benefit from Mrs. Bantry's untimely demise, or whether everyone was too stunned by grief to recognize the predators gathering around the feast. The announcement appeared in the morning papers with the stark brevity that befitted such solemn occasions. Mrs. Dorothy Bantry of Gossington Hall will be remembered at a memorial service on Thursday at St. Mary Mead Church. Owing to medical circumstances, the service will be closed casket. The family requests privacy during this difficult time. Miss Marple read the notice over her breakfast tea with the particular attention she reserved for announcements that seem to contain more questions than answers. The phrase medical circumstances struck her as unusually vague, even for such delicate matters. In her considerable experience, families generally preferred either complete disclosure or complete silence to such ambiguous middle ground. The service was scheduled for 2 hours, allowing the morning for final preparations at both the church and Gossington Hall. Miss Marple arrived at St. Mary Mead Church somewhat earlier than most mourners, ostensibly to assist Mrs. Clement with the flower arrangements, but actually to observe the various preparations with her customarily sharp eye. She found the church, already draped in the somber elegance appropriate to such occasions. Black crape adorned the altar, and the wreaths from the previous day had been arranged with tasteful symmetry around the chancel. At the center of it all stood the closed casket, its polished mahogany surface reflecting the colored light from the stained glass windows. "Such a beautiful service you've arranged, Mrs. Clement," Miss Marple observed to the vicar's wife, who was adjusting the final flower arrangements with the practiced efficiency of long experience. "Thank you, dear, though I must say Colonel Bantry has been most specific about certain details. The closed casket, for instance, most unusual, but he was quite insistent. Medical reasons, I understand. So Dr. Haydock explained. Something about the nature of the circumstances. Quite distressing for the family, I'm sure." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically while making note of the service sheets that lay in neat stacks near the entrance. The black-edged paper was of excellent quality, crisp and fresh from the printer. She picked up one of the sheets, ostensibly to check the order of service, but actually to examine the paper more closely. Holding it up to the light streaming through the windows, she could clearly see the watermark, a modern design featuring the printer's mark and the current year. The paper was not merely fresh. It was recent enough to have been ordered and printed within the last few days. "Such lovely paper," she remarked to Mrs. Clement, "though I thought Colonel Bantry mentioned using some of Mrs. Bantry's own stationery for the service." "Oh no, dear. This was specially ordered. Colonel Bantry said the family stationery wasn't quite appropriate for such a formal service. He was very particular about having everything done properly." Miss Marple tucked this information away with the growing collection of small inconsistencies that surrounded Mrs. Bantry's death. The speed with which such elegant arrangements had been made was remarkable, suggesting either extraordinary efficiency or advanced preparation that bordered on the prescient. As the mourners began to arrive, Miss Marple positioned herself in a pew that provided an excellent view of both the congregation and the various entrances. Inspector Slack had arrived early and taken a discreet position near the back, his presence adding an official gravity to the proceedings that did not go unnoticed by the assembled villagers. The service itself was conducted with appropriate dignity by the Reverend Clement, whose eulogy struck just the right note between personal warmth and clerical solemnity. Colonel Bantry sat in the front pew, his military bearing intact, despite the obvious strain of recent events. Mrs. Pike occupied a prominent position nearby, her black attire impeccable, and her expression suitably grave. What struck Miss Marple as curious was the absence of any family beyond Colonel Bantry himself. Veronica Denham's departure had been explained by grief, but the complete lack of other relatives seemed unusual for a woman who had been active in county society for 30 years. After the service, as the congregation moved slowly toward the exits, Miss Marple found herself walking beside Inspector Slack. Their conversation, conducted in the hushed tones appropriate to the circumstances, proved illuminating. "Sad business," the inspector observed, "though I must say everything's been handled with remarkable efficiency. Indeed, the arrangements seem almost too perfect, don't they?" Slack gave her a sharp look. "Meaning what exactly?" "Nothing specific, Inspector. Merely that grief usually produces a certain disorganization, whereas this has all proceeded with clockwork precision. Colonel Bantry's military background, I expect, used to handling logistics under pressure." "Quite possibly, though I couldn't help noticing that constable you've posted at the hall. Purely routine, I suppose. Standard procedure in cases of suspicious death. Though between you and me, Miss Marple, there are a few details that don't quite add up." They paused at the lich gate, where Miss Marple noticed something that made her bend down as if adjusting her shoe. Embedded in the ancient wood of the gatepost was a small bead of what appeared to be sealing wax, still soft enough to show the clear impression of a key. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I wonder if you might spare a moment to examine something rather interesting." Slack followed her gaze to the wax impression, his expression growing considerably more alert. "Well, well, that's fresh, I'd say. Very fresh indeed. Within the last day or two, I should think. And unless I'm much mistaken, it's an impression of a rather specific type of key. House key, you think?" "Possibly. Though it might be worth checking what locks at Gossington Hall use keys of this particular size and shape." As they walked back toward the village, Miss Marple reflected on the morning's observations. The hastily printed service sheets, the suspiciously perfect arrangements, the mysterious wax impression at the lich gate. Each detail added another piece to a puzzle that was becoming more complex rather than clearer. Most intriguing of all was the closed casket itself. In her considerable experience of village life, Miss Marple had learned that families almost always prefer to have their loved ones' appearances restored for final farewells, regardless of the circumstances of death. The insistence on a closed casket suggested either damage too severe to repair, or perhaps, and this thought made her pause in her walking, the absence of anyone to repair. She reached her cottage with her mind racing through possibilities, each more intriguing than the st. If her growing suspicions were correct, then yesterday's memorial service had been an elaborate piece of theater, performed for the benefit of an audience that had no idea they were watching a carefully scripted drama rather than a genuine expression of grief. The question was, what had the performance been designed to conceal? And more urgently, where was the real Mrs. Dolly Bantry, while everyone believed her to be safely enclosed in that polished mahogany casket? The answers, Miss Marple was certain, lay somewhere in the maze of details that surrounded this most unusual death, a death that was beginning to seem far less final than appearances suggested. The vicarage tea that afternoon possessed all the subdued gentility that such occasions demanded, with Mrs. Clement presiding over the teapot with practiced grace, while the assembled ladies of St. Mary Mead discussed the morning service in appropriately hushed tones. Miss Marple had accepted the invitation with particular pleasure, knowing that such gatherings often provided opportunities for the sort of informal conversation that formal interviews could never achieve. The drawing-room held its usual complement of village worthies. Mrs. Price Ridley, whose opinions on proper morning protocols were as rigid as her posture. Miss Weatherby, who possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of county genealogy, and several other ladies whose collective memory spanned generations of local history. The conversation naturally centered on Mrs. Bantry's tragic end and the exemplary manner in which the arrangements had been conducted. "Such a beautiful service," declared Mrs. Price Ridley, accepting her second cup of tea with regal dignity. "Though I must say the closed casket was rather unusual. In my experience, families prefer to have a proper farewell." "Medical necessities," murmured Miss Weatherby. "Dr. Haydock was quite specific about that. The nature of the poisoning, you understand." Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision. "I couldn't help noticing how quickly everything was arranged. Remarkable efficiency under such distressing circumstances. Colonel Bantry's military training, no doubt," suggested Mrs. Clement, though I must admit some details seemed almost too well organized. The printing of the service sheets, for instance. They were ready remarkably quickly. "Modern printing methods are quite efficient," Mrs. Price Ridley observed, "though I did wonder about the choice of paper. That particular black-edged design isn't something one typically keeps in stock." Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. "You noticed the paper quality as well. I thought it seemed rather fresh. Indeed, the watermark was quite modern. I couldn't help but notice when I held it to the light during the hymn." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Pike, who entered with the purposeful air of someone bearing important news. She was still dressed in deep mourning, though her manner suggested efficiency rather than grief. "Ladies," she announced, "I've just come from Gossington Hall. There are several matters regarding Mrs. Bantry's affairs that require immediate attention." Mrs. Clement offered tea, which Mrs. Pike accepted while settling herself with the air of someone preparing to deliver a significant announcement. "The hospital fund accounts, for instance. I've discovered some irregularities that need to be addressed before the next committee meeting. Nothing serious, but these things must be handled properly." Miss Marple's expression remained pleasantly interested. "Irregularities? How concerning?" "Small discrepancies in the ledger entries. Probably just clerical errors, but they require investigation. Unfortunately, some of the documentation appears to be missing from Mrs. Bantry's files." "Missing?" Miss Weatherby looked scandalized. "Dolly was always meticulous about record-keeping." "Indeed she was, which makes the gaps all the more puzzling." Mrs. Pike stirred her tea thoughtfully. "I suspect she may have moved some papers to a more secure location. The safe, perhaps, or a bank deposit box." Miss Marple noted the calculating gleam in Mrs. Pike's eyes. "Have you discussed this with Colonel Bantry?" "Briefly. Poor man is quite overwhelmed with funeral arrangements and legal matters. I offered to handle the fund's affairs to spare him additional burden." "How thoughtful," murmured Mrs. Clement, though her tone suggested some reservation about such eagerness to assume responsibility. The conversation turned to other matters, but Miss Marple found herself studying Mrs. Pike with renewed interest. The woman's concern for the fund's paperwork seemed disproportionate to the urgency she claimed, and her knowledge of potential storage locations suggested a familiarity with Mrs. Bantry's private arrangements that went beyond normal committee business. After the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple chose to walk home by the longer route that took her past Gossington Hall's kitchen gardens. The October afternoon was crisp and clear, perfect for the sort of reflective stroll that often proved conducive to organizing one's thoughts about complex problems. She found herself pausing at the herb border, where she had discovered the foxglove fragments. The plants looked undisturbed since her previous visit, their dying leaves rustling softly in the autumn breeze. But as she prepared to continue her walk, a slight movement caught her attention. Mrs. Pike was kneeling among the herbs, apparently examining the plantings with considerable care. She held a length of string which she was using to measure something among the dying stems. When she noticed Miss Marple's approach, she straightened with obvious embarrassment. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect to encounter anyone here. Such a lovely afternoon for garden work. Are you planning some planting?" "Actually, I was choosing rosemary for a memorial wreath. Mrs. Bantry was particularly fond of the herb garden, and I thought it would be a fitting tribute." Miss Marple nodded approvingly, while noting that Mrs. Pike's hands showed no evidence of gathering herbs, despite her stated purpose. The string she carried appeared to be marked at regular intervals, suggesting measurement rather than harvesting. "What a thoughtful gesture. Though I believe the rosemary plants are toward the other end of the border." Mrs. Pike glanced quickly toward the area Miss Marple indicated, then back at the foxglove plants where she'd been working. "Yes, of course. I was just examining the overall layout first." As they walked together toward the lane, Miss Marple casually touched the string Mrs. Pike carried. The surface felt slightly sticky with a waxy residue that caught the light. The material was unmistakably sealing wax, still soft enough to hold fingerprints and impressions. "What an interesting string," Miss Marple observed. "It has such an unusual texture." Mrs. Pike quickly wound the string into a tight coil and tucked it into her handbag. Just ordinary garden twine, nothing special about it. But Miss Marple had seen enough to confirm her growing suspicions. The combination of Mrs. Pike's presence in the herb garden, her interest in Mrs. Bantry's private papers, and her possession of string coated with sealing wax created a pattern that was becoming increasingly clear. As they parted ways at the lane, Miss Marple reflected on the afternoon's revelations. Mrs. Pike's eagerness to assume control of the hospital fund, her detailed knowledge of where important papers might be stored, and her mysterious activities in the garden suggested someone with plans that extended far beyond simple administrative assistance. Most significantly, the sealing wax on the string connected directly to the key impression she had discovered at the lich gate. Someone had been taking impressions of keys, and that same someone had been measuring or marking something among the herbs where the foxglove grew. The picture that was emerging suggested not a crime of passion or opportunity, but a carefully planned scheme that had required considerable advanced preparation. The question was whether that scheme had succeeded as intended, or whether certain crucial elements had not proceeded according to plan. Miss Marple reached her cottage as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her irresistibly of autumn leaves. She settled into her favorite chair by the window, her knitting in her lap, and gazed thoughtfully toward Gossington Hall. Somewhere in that imposing house lay the answers to questions that were becoming more intriguing by the hour. But first, she needed to understand exactly what Mrs. Pike had been measuring in the garden, and why anyone would need a wax impression of keys belonging to a house whose owners had supposedly just suffered a tragic loss. The truth, Miss Marple suspected, would prove far more complex than anyone yet imagined. Miss Marple had never considered herself the sort of person who engaged in midnight surveillance, but exceptional circumstances, she reflected, called for exceptional measures. The evening had settled into that profound darkness, that only October nights in the English countryside could provide, with clouds obscuring the moon, and a light mist rising from the river to blur the edges of familiar landmarks. She had positioned herself in the shrubbery that bordered Gossington Hall's library wing, wrapped in her warmest coat, and accompanied by Sergeant Lake, whom Inspector Slack had assigned to watch the house following her afternoon report about Mrs. Pike's suspicious behavior. The young sergeant possessed the patient stillness that came from military training, and Miss Marple found his presence both reassuring and professionally competent. "You're certain she'll come tonight?" Lake whispered, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "As certain as one can be about human nature," Miss Marple replied softly. "Mrs. Pike has been far too eager to gain access to Mrs. Bantry's papers. The memorial service this morning would have created the perfect opportunity for someone to slip away unnoticed and make the necessary preparations." They had been waiting for nearly 2 hours when Miss Marple heard the soft click of a key turning in a lock. The sound came from the French doors that led from the terrace into the morning room, the same room where Mrs. Bantry had taken her fateful breakfast only 3 days earlier. A shadow moved against the faint light from the windows, revealing the unmistakable silhouette of Mrs. Pike as she slipped into the house with the careful movements of someone familiar with the layout. She carried no lantern but seemed to navigate the darkened rooms with confidence. "There," Miss Marple breathed. "Just as I expected." Sergeant Lake nodded grimly and began to move forward, but Miss Marple caught his arm. "Let her complete whatever she's come to do. We need to understand her purpose, not merely catch her in the act." Through the library windows they could see Mrs. Pike's figure moving toward the desk where Mrs. Bantry had kept her correspondence and committee papers. The woman worked quickly but methodically, lifting papers and examining them in the faint light before replacing them carefully. Her movement suggested someone searching for specific documents rather than conducting a general exploration. After several minutes, Mrs. Pike lifted something substantial from the desk's main drawer, the leather-bound ledger that contained the hospital fund's accounts. Miss Marple had seen Mrs. Bantry consulting the same book during committee meetings, noting donations and expenditures with the meticulous care that characterized her approach to charitable work. Mrs. Pike opened the ledger and began examining its pages by the light of a small electric torch. Even from their position outside, Miss Marple could see the woman's increasing agitation as she turned page after page, apparently searching for something that wasn't where she expected to find it. "Now would be an appropriate time, Sergeant," Miss Marple whispered. Lake moved with swift efficiency, circling the house to enter through the front door, while Miss Marple remained at her observation post. The sound of his approach must have alerted Mrs. Pike, because she suddenly dropped the ledger and rushed toward the French doors through which she had entered. But Sergeant Lake had anticipated this route of escape. As Mrs. Pike emerged onto the terrace clutching something to her chest, she found herself face to face with the young policeman's imposing figure. "Mrs. Pike," he said with quiet authority, "I think you'd better explain what you're doing here at this hour." The ledger fell from Mrs. Pike's hands, its pages scattering across the flagstones in the light breeze. Miss Marple emerged from her hiding place and began gathering the scattered papers, noting immediately that something was wrong with their arrangement. "How very interesting," she murmured, holding several pages up to catch the light from Lake's torch. "Sergeant, I think you'll find that this ledger has been rather cleverly altered." Under closer examination, the evidence of tampering became unmistakable. The ledger contained 2 distinct sets of pages, the original entries in Mrs. Bantry's neat handwriting, and a series of replacement pages that had been carefully inserted to match the book's original format. The binding showed fresh glue at several points along the spine, and one of the replacement pages bore a telltale smear of something that looked remarkably like orange marmalade. "Mrs. Pike," Miss Marple said gently, "I believe this page may bear your fingerprint, preserved in marmalade. How very careless to handle the fund's accounts immediately after tampering with Mrs. Bantry's breakfast tray." Mrs. Pike's composure finally cracked. "You don't understand," she said desperately. "I never meant for anyone to be hurt. It was supposed to be just enough to make her ill, to keep her away from the committee meeting until I could sort everything out." "Sort out the missing money, you mean?" Sergeant Lake observed. "The advances you took from the fund without proper authorization." "They weren't advances. They were loans. I always intended to replace the money once my investments paid off. But Mrs. Bantry was becoming suspicious, asking too many questions about the accounts." Miss Marple examined the doctored ledger pages more carefully. "So you decided to stage her death to create enough confusion to cover your embezzlement. The foxglove was meant to simulate heart failure. I suppose just enough to make her collapse. During the committee meeting, I had the fake pages ready to substitute, and Dr. Haydock would have attributed her illness to natural causes. But she didn't eat the marmalade at the meeting. She had it at breakfast instead, and there was much more of the foxglove mixture than I intended. Because you prepared the entire jar, not just a single serving," Miss Marple concluded. "How much did you take from the fund, Mrs. Pike?" "300, Mrs. Pike whispered. "I was desperate. My brother's business was failing, and I thought I could replace it before anyone noticed." Sergeant Lake had been taking notes throughout this confession. "Mrs. Pike, I'm arresting you for the attempted murder of Mrs. Bantry and for embezzlement of charitable funds." As they walked back toward the village, Miss Marple reflected on the evening's revelations. Mrs. Pike's scheme had been clever but flawed, the sort of plan that seemed foolproof in theory but collapsed under the weight of unexpected complications. The woman had never intended murder, but her willingness to poison Mrs. Bantry, even mildly, revealed a moral flexibility that made her other crimes seem almost inevitable. "What I don't understand," Sergeant Lake said as they reached the lane, "is how Mrs. Pike got access to the house tonight. The doors were supposed to be locked." Miss Marple smiled in the darkness. "I suspect you'll find that the key impression we discovered at the Lich Gate provided the answer to that problem. Mrs. Pike has been planning this for some time, Sergeant. The sealing wax, the replacement ledger pages, the carefully timed poisoning, all of it required advanced preparation. But if Mrs. Bantry is really dead, why was Mrs. Pike still trying to alter the accounts?" "An excellent question," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "Unless, of course, Mrs. Pike had a reason to believe that her crime hadn't succeeded quite as completely as everyone supposed." They walked the rest of the way in contemplative silence, each absorbed in thoughts about the complexities of human nature and the unexpected directions that desperate measures could take. Behind them, Gossington Hall stood dark and silent, keeping its secrets as closely as it had for the past 3 centuries. But Miss Marple suspected that those secrets were about to be revealed in ways that would surprise everyone who thought they understood what had really happened on that fateful morning when Mrs. Bantry collapsed over her breakfast marmalade. The morning following Mrs. Pike's arrest brought with it the peculiar atmosphere that settles over a community when long-held assumptions are suddenly overturned. Word of the midnight incident at Gossington Hall had spread through St. Mary Me with the efficiency that only truly shocking news could achieve, leaving the village buzzing with questions that seemed to multiply rather than diminish as more details emerged. Miss Marple rose early, her mind occupied with the loose threads that Mrs. Pike's confession had failed to tie together. while the woman's attempt at embezzlement and her misguided poisoning scheme explained, several crucial elements remained disturbingly unclear. Chief among these was the question of Mrs. Bantry's actual condition, for Mrs. Pike's evident surprise at finding herself still needing to alter the accounts suggested that she, like everyone else, believed her victim to be genuinely dead. A light breakfast. Miss Marple made her way to Gossington Hall, where Inspector Slack had granted her permission to examine the physical evidence that had been gathered during the investigation. The house felt different in the morning light, less oppressive than it had during the days immediately following the tragedy, but somehow more mysterious, as if it were holding secrets that went beyond the obvious crime. James admitted her with his customary dignity, though she noticed that the butler's composure showed signs of strain. The household staff had been profoundly affected by recent events, and the revelation of Mrs. Pike's criminal activities had added another layer of distress to their genuine grief. "Inspector Slack is in the library, Miss Marple," James informed her. "He said you were to have complete access to whatever you needed to examine." Miss Marple found the inspector surrounded by evidence bags and official documents, his expression that of a man wrestling with a puzzle that refused to yield its final pieces. He looked up as she entered, his relief at seeing her both obvious and somewhat touching. "Miss Marple, thank goodness you're here. This Pike business has cleared up one mystery, but it's created half a dozen others. Nothing seems to fit together properly." "In what way, Inspector?" "Well, for starters, Dr. Haydock's medical report doesn't match what Pike told us last night. According to him, the amount of foxglove she actually consumed would have been fatal within hours, not the gradual poisoning Pike claims she intended." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her feet. "Have you examined the physical evidence from the morning room? That's where things get really peculiar." Slack gestured toward a collection of items laid out on the library table. "Look at this." He showed her several charred fragments that had been retrieved from the kitchen and range as ashes. The pieces were clearly remnants of black-edged notepaper, similar to that used for the sympathy cards and memorial service sheets. But more intriguing was a partially melted lump of sealing wax that bore the clear impression of a key. "Someone's been burning evidence," Miss Marple observed, and rather hastily from the look of these fragments. "That's not all. We found this in Mrs. Pike's handbag when we searched her last night." Slack produced a rolled typing ribbon, its fabric showing signs of recent use. "Several of the fund's circular letters show that same misaligned E that Pike's typewriter produces." Miss Marple examined the ribbon carefully. "So Mrs. Pike was responsible for the forged sympathy cards as well?" "She was certainly thorough in her preparations. Too thorough, if you ask me. All this advanced planning for what she claims was supposed to be a minor poisoning. It doesn't add up." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Dr. Haydock entered, carrying a small parcel and wearing an expression that struck Miss Marple as oddly significant. "Inspector," the doctor said formally, "I've brought the remaining personal effects from Mrs. Bantry from the hospital." He set the parcel on the table with careful precision. "I thought Colonel Bantry should have them." "Of course, Doctor, though he's not in the house at present. Perhaps Miss Marple could see that he receives them." Dr. Haydock's eyes met hers with a meaningful look. "I'm sure she understands the importance of returning personal items to their proper place." After the doctor departed, Miss Marple opened the parcel with growing curiosity. Inside, wrapped in soft tissue paper, was Mrs. Bantry's favorite teacup, the delicate spode china she'd used every morning for breakfast. The cup was completely intact, showing no signs of damage or distress. "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured, turning the cup in her hands. "Inspector, I wonder if you might explain something to me." "Certainly. If Mrs. Bantry died at the hospital, as we've been told, how is it that her personal teacup the one she was drinking from when she collapsed, has found its way back to us in perfect condition. Slack stared at the cup with dawning comprehension. Hospital procedure would be to retain anything that might be evidence in a poisoning case. Precisely. And surely no undertaker would have been permitted to remove personal effects from a case still under investigation. Miss Marple set the cup down gently. Unless, of course, there was no body to prepare for burial. The implications of this discovery settled over them like a fog. If Mrs. Bantry's teacup has been returned by Dr. Haydock personally, and if he has emphasized its importance in returning items to their proper place, then perhaps the entire premise of our investigation needs to be reconsidered. Miss Marple, Slack said slowly, are you suggesting that Mrs. Bantry isn't actually dead? I'm suggesting, Inspector, that we may have been witnessing an extremely elaborate performance staged for reasons we're only beginning to understand. As if to emphasize this point, a memory surfaced of Dr. Haydock's parting words, the importance of returning things to their proper place. In the context of Mrs. Bantry's daily routine, the proper place for her breakfast teacup would be the morning room sideboard where it had sat every day for 30 years. But if Mrs. Bantry was alive to reclaim her cup, then the question became not who had killed her, but why everyone needed to believe she was dead. And more urgently, where was she now? While her supposed memorial service had been conducted, and her grieving husband struggled with arrangements for a funeral that might prove to be entirely unnecessary, Miss Marple rose from her chair, her mind racing through the implications of this new evidence. Inspector, she said firmly, I believe we need to have a very serious conversation with Dr. Haydock, and perhaps it's time to examine that closed casket rather more carefully than we have done. The truth, she was certain, would prove far stranger than any fiction, and considerably more complex than anyone had yet imagined. The afternoon of the memorial service arrived with the sort of gray solemnity that seemed to validate the somber occasion. By 2, St. Mary Mead Church was filled with mourners dressed in appropriate black, their voices hushed in deference to grief, and their faces reflecting the genuine sorrow that follows the loss of a beloved community figure. Miss Marple sat in her customary pew, but her attention was divided between the service and her growing certainty that the day would bring revelations far more dramatic than anyone anticipated. The previous night's discoveries had confirmed her suspicions about the theatrical nature of recent events, and she'd spent the morning hours in consultation with Inspector Slack, arranging certain precautions that she hoped would prove unnecessary, but suspected would be essential. The church itself had been transformed into a tableau of mourning. The closed casket, draped in white lilies, occupied the central position before the altar, while the autumn flowers from the various wreaths created a garden of remembrance around the chancel. Colonel Bantry sat in the front pew, his bearing rigidly correct despite the obvious strain of recent days. The congregation included virtually every resident of St. Mary Mead, testament to the genuine affection in which Mrs. Bantry had been held. But it was the late arrival of Veronica Denham that caught Miss Marple's particular attention. Mrs. Bantry's cousin entered just as the service began, heavily veiled and dressed in the elaborate mourning attire that suggested grief too profound for ordinary consolation. She took a seat near the side aisle, positioning herself where she could observe the proceedings while remaining relatively conspicuous. The Reverend Clement conducted the service with appropriate dignity, his eulogy striking just the right note between personal warmth and clerical solemnity. But Miss Marple found herself watching Veronica rather than listening to the familiar words of comfort, noting the woman's restless attention to details that seemed unrelated to spiritual matters. As the service drew toward its conclusion, Veronica rose quietly and slipped from her pew, moving toward the vestry with the purposeful step of someone on a specific mission. Miss Marple observed this departure with interest, then caught Inspector Slack's eye and nodded meaningfully. Rather than following immediately, Miss Marple waited until the congregation began filing out before making her own way toward the vestry. She found Veronica there, no longer the picture of overwhelming grief, but instead a woman engaged in urgent practical business. The elaborate veil had been pushed back, revealing features sharp with concentration, rather than soft with sorrow. Veronica stood before the vestry safe, its door open and its contents scattered across the nearby table. Bearer bonds, legal documents, and various papers of obvious value lay in neat piles, as Veronica sorted through them with practiced efficiency. "Looking for something specific, my dear?" Miss Marple inquired mildly. Veronica spun around, her face flushing with embarrassment and something that might have been fear. "Miss Marple, I didn't hear you come in. I imagine you were rather absorbed in your task. These appear to be quite valuable documents." "Dolly left me a small bequest," Veronica said quickly, her hands moving to conceal something behind her back. "I was simply looking for the relevant papers. Colonel Bantry is so overwhelmed with arrangements. I thought I might spare him this additional burden." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple replied. "Though I wonder if you might show me this bequest you mentioned. I'm sure Colonel Bantry would want to ensure that Dolly's wishes are properly honored." Veronica's composure began to crack. It's a private matter, a family understanding rather than a formal document." Miss Marple moved closer, noting that Veronica had been attempting to hide a small brass key, the spare key to the morning room desk that had gone missing after Mrs. Bantry's collapse. "And this key? Was that part of your understanding with Dolly as well?" Before Veronica could respond, Inspector Slack entered the vestry, his presence filling the small space with official authority. "Miss Denham," he said formally, "I think you'd better explain what you're doing with those bonds." The game was up, and Veronica knew it. Her shoulders sagged as the pretense of grief fell away entirely. "You don't understand," she said desperately. "I needed the money. My debts in London, I was facing complete ruin. So you decided to take advantage of your cousin's death to steal her securities," Slack observed. "It wasn't stealing. We're family. Dolly would have wanted to help if she'd known how desperate my situation had become." Miss Marple examined the bonds that Veronica had been attempting to conceal. "But you couldn't wait for natural inheritance, could you? These are bearer bonds, untraceable once removed from their safe storage. Perfect for someone needing to disappear quickly with portable wealth." "The funeral chaos was perfect cover," Slack added. "Everyone focused on mourning while you helped yourself to whatever you could carry." Veronica's face showed the calculation of someone weighing her options and finding them all unsatisfactory. "How did you know I would be here?" "Because," Miss Marple said gently, "you made the same mistake that Mrs. Pike made. You both acted too quickly, with too much knowledge of where valuable things were kept. Mrs. Pike knew about the hospital fund accounts, and you knew about the bonds in the vestry safe. But how could I have known? Unless—" Veronica stopped herself, but too late. "Unless you had been planning this for some time," Miss Marple finished. "Long enough to take that wax impression of the spare key, which you retrieved from the lich gate and used to gain access to the house while everyone was distracted by the memorial arrangements." As Inspector Slack placed Veronica under arrest, Miss Marple reflected on the afternoon's revelations. Two separate criminals, each taking advantage of Mrs. Bantry's supposed death to pursue their own schemes. Mrs. Pike had tried to cover her embezzlement by staging a poisoning, while Veronica had attempted to steal bonds during the chaos that followed. But neither crime explained the most puzzling aspects of the case: the advanced sympathy cards, the two perfect arrangements, or most significantly, the intact teacup that Dr. Haydock had returned with such meaningful emphasis. As they left the vestry, Miss Marple noticed that the memorial service had concluded, and the congregation was dispersing, but one figure remained conspicuously absent from the general exodus: Colonel Bantry himself, who should have been receiving condolences, but was nowhere to be seen. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "I believe it's time we had that conversation with Dr. Haydock, and perhaps we should check on Colonel Bantry's whereabouts. I have a feeling that this afternoon's revelations are far from complete." The truth, Miss Marple was certain, lay not in the crimes they had uncovered, but in the curious absence of genuine grief from those who should have been most affected by Mrs. Bantry's death. When people who claimed to love someone showed more interest in their possessions than their passing, it suggested that perhaps the passing itself was not quite what it appeared to be. And if that was the case, then the afternoon's memorial service had been not just a celebration of life, but a carefully orchestrated deception designed to conceal something far more complex than simple theft or embezzlement. The drawing room at Gossington Hall had never hosted a gathering quite like the one that assembled there. As the October afternoon faded into evening, Inspector Slack had closed the doors with ceremonial gravity, creating an atmosphere of formal revelation that seemed to charge the very air with anticipation. The principal players in the drama were all present: Colonel Bantry, his face bearing the strain of recent days; Dr. Haydock, unusually quiet and watchful; the Reverend and Mrs. Clement summoned from the church; and Miss Marple herself, seated with her knitting as if this were merely another social call. The room bore witness to the events of recent days. Mrs. Pike's doctored ledger lay open on the side table, its false pages clearly marked with evidence tags. The bearer bonds that Veronica had attempted to steal were arranged nearby, along with the various items of physical evidence that had been gathered during the investigation. But most prominently displayed was Mrs. Bantry's intact teacup, sitting on the mantelpiece like a silent accusation. Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded the assembled company with a gentle authority that had served her so well in previous investigations. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "I believe it's time we discussed what really happened on that Tuesday morning, when Mrs. Bantry appeared to die from foxglove poisoning." Inspector Slack opened his notebook expectantly, while the others settled into their chairs with the air of people preparing for revelations they both dreaded and desired. "The first thing we must understand," Miss Marple continued, "is that we have been witnessing not one crime, but several separate schemes that became entangled in the most remarkable way. Mrs. Pike attempted to poison Mrs. Bantry to cover her. Embezzlement of hospital fund money. Miss Denham planned to steal bearer bonds during the chaos following her cousin's death. Both women were genuine criminals with genuine motives. But neither crime explains the most puzzling aspects of this case: the sympathy cards that arrived before any tragedy occurred, the perfectly organized memorial service with its suspiciously fresh stationery, the closed casket that no one was permitted to view, and most tellingly, the return of Mrs. Bantry's personal teacup in perfect condition. Dr. Haydock shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but said nothing. "The truth," Miss Marple announced quietly, "is that Mrs. Bantry discovered the foxglove leaves in her marmalade the evening before her supposed death. She found the strange bitter residue on the jar's rim, and being a sensible woman with knowledge of country matters, recognized the danger immediately. Colonel Bantry's military bearing finally cracked. She came to me in a state of considerable alarm," he admitted. "Someone had tried to poison her, but the attempt had been clumsy. There were leaf fragments scattered around the herb garden, and the marmalade had been contaminated unevenly. "So you devised a plan," Miss Marple observed approvingly. Dr. Haydock, being a trusted friend, was brought into the conspiracy. Mrs. Bantry would stage her own death to flush out both the poisoner and any other criminals who might take advantage of the situation. Dr. Haydock nodded slowly. "We used a harmless emetic to simulate the symptoms of poisoning. Arthur carried Dolly to the ambulance. I announced her death to create the proper confusion, and we moved her to the Clements guest room, where she could remain hidden while we watched, to see who would reveal themselves." Mrs. Clement looked surprised but pleased. "She's been knitting the most beautiful baby clothes. Such a productive patient." The closed casket, Miss Marple continued, contained nothing more significant than sandbags to provide appropriate weight. The memorial service was genuine enough in its sentiment, but entirely unnecessary in its purpose. Inspector Slack looked up from his notes. So Mrs. Pike's confession was accurate. She really did try to poison Mrs. Bantry. Oh yes, quite genuine. The foxglove was real, the intent was criminal, and the embezzlement was exactly as she described. Mrs. Pike's crime was attempted murder, regardless of whether it succeeded. Similarly, Miss Denham's theft was real enough, even though the victim was very much alive to report it. "But how did you know?" Colonel Bantry asked. "What gave us away?" Miss Marple smiled. "Several things, actually. The sympathy cards arriving before any cause for sympathy suggested advanced planning. The quality and freshness of the memorial stationery indicated preparation rather than grief-stricken haste. Most conclusively, Dr. Haydock's return of the teacup, with his emphasis on restoring things to their proper place, was the sort of gentle hint that suggested Mrs. Bantry might soon reclaim her usual breakfast routine. As if summoned by these words, the drawing-room door opened with dramatic timing that no theatrical director could have improved upon. Mrs. Dolly Bantry entered, very much alive and considerably annoyed, her silver hair perfectly arranged, and her blue eyes bright with indignation. "Really, Arthur?" she declared, surveying the elaborate floral arrangements that had been moved from the church. "I never liked lilies. They're far too funereal for my taste." The silence that followed was profound. Inspector Slack's notebook slipped from his nerveless fingers. The Reverend Clement looked as if he had witnessed a resurrection. Mrs. Clement beamed with obvious delight at seeing her secret patient restored to her proper place. "Now then," Mrs. Bantry continued briskly, settling into her favorite chair as if she'd never been away. "I understand we've caught both Mrs. Pike and that dreadful cousin of mine in their respective thieveries. Excellent work all around, though. I must say, listening to my own memorial service from the vestry was rather more tedious than I had expected." Miss Marple retrieved her knitting with satisfaction. "The truth has a way of revealing itself, my dear Dolly, though I must commend you and Colonel Bantry on a most convincing performance." "Hardly a performance," Mrs. Bantry replied tartly. "Someone really did try to poison me after all. We simply ensured that they wouldn't succeed while we identified all the vultures circling around my supposed corpse." Inspector Slack had recovered, enough to close his notebook. "Mrs. Pike will be charged with attempted murder and embezzlement. Miss Denham with attempted theft, though I suppose the death certificate will need to be revised." Dr. Haydock grinned for the first time in days. "I never actually filed one. Professional caution, you understand." As the various participants in the drama prepared to depart, Miss Marple reflected on the curious way that truth and deception had intertwined in this most unusual case. Genuine crimes had been committed. Real dangers had been faced, and justice would be served. But the supposed victim had remained safely alive throughout, protected by the combined efforts of those who truly cared for her welfare. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Bantry said as the others filed out, "I believe I owe you considerable gratitude. Your investigation prevented 2 criminals from escaping justice." "Not at all, my dear, though I must say your performance was remarkably convincing. You had me worried for quite some time." Mrs. Bantry smiled as she rang for James to arrange a proper tea service. "Well, one learns things from reading detective novels, you know, though I prefer the sort where the victim survives to see justice done." Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to return to her cottage, where she would spend the evening reflecting on the curious ways that human nature reveals itself under pressure. Some people, like Mrs. Pike and Veronica Denham, allow desperation to corrupt their moral foundations. Others, like the Bantrys and Dr. Hayduck, find creative ways to protect what they value most. And sometimes, Miss Marple thought as she walked through the October evening, the truth proved more satisfying than any fiction, particularly when it included the resurrection of someone presumed lost and the triumph of justice over greed. Behind her, the lights of Gossington Hall blazed warmly against the darkness. No longer a house of mourning, but once again a proper home, where Mrs. Bantry could resume her interrupted breakfast routine with marmalade that contained nothing more dangerous than oranges and sugar.